Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The early 18th century was a time of great upheaval in the British colonies of North America. One of the most significant conflicts to erupt during this period was the Yamasee War, 1715 to 1717, a devastating uprising led by a coalition of Native American tribes against British settlers in the province of Carolina. What began as a response to colonial encroachments, exploitation, and aggressive trade practices soon spiraled into a conflict that had far-reaching consequences for British colonial expansion. While the war ended with a fragile peace, its aftermath reshaped the power dynamics in the American Southeast, altered British policies, and influenced the trajectory of Native resistance. The Yamasee War was fueled by tensions over trade practices, territorial encroachment, and the increasing presence of British settlers. The Yamasee, once allies of the British, found themselves subjected to unfair trade deals, mounting debts, and the looming threat of enslavement. In April 1715, the war erupted when the Yamasee and their allies launched a series of surprise attacks on British settlements, killing hundreds of settlers and disrupting trade routes. What followed was a prolonged and bloody conflict that saw the British struggling to maintain control. The war forced colonial authorities to rethink their approach to indigenous relations, leading to significant changes in British colonial policies. One of the most immediate impacts of the war was the weakening of the Carolina colony. Before the conflict, Carolina had been one of the most prosperous British territories in North America, largely due to the lucrative deerskin trade and the use of Native American allies for labor and military purposes. However, the war devastated the colony's economy, depopulated frontier settlements, and exposed the vulnerability of British forces. This instability contributed to the division of Carolina into two separate colonies, North and South Carolina, in 1719, marking a turning point in British colonial administration. The war also altered British expansionist policies. Prior to 1715, the British had relied heavily on Native American alliances to expand their frontier and secure trade routes. The betrayal felt by the Yamasee and other tribes shifted this dynamic, forcing the British to adopt a more militarized approach to colonial governance. The war's aftermath saw the construction of new forts, the formation of defensive militias, and a greater emphasis on enslaved African labor as Native American slave trade routes collapsed. These changes reinforced a racialized social order in the colonies and accelerated the importation of enslaved Africans, shaping the labor force of the American South for generations to come. Another significant consequence of the war was the shifting balance of power among Native American tribes. The Creek Confederacy, which had initially supported the Yamasee, later aligned with the British, ensuring their own survival at the expense of their former allies. The Cherokee, who had remained neutral at first, were rewarded by the British for their eventual assistance. This realignment of power not only weakened the Yamasee, but also contributed to intertribal conflicts that played into British hands, allowing for greater colonial control over native lands. Ultimately, the Yamasee War marked the beginning of a new era in British-Native relations. While the British emerged victorious, their approach to colonial expansion had to be restructured. The war demonstrated the dangers of exploitative trade practices, the limitations of military force, and the necessity of more strategic alliances. These lessons shaped British colonial policies for decades, influencing how future conflicts with Native Americans were managed and setting the stage for continued territorial expansion. The Colfax Massacre of 1873 stands as one of the most horrific yet often overlooked episodes of racial violence in American history. Taking place in the small town of Colfax, Louisiana, this massacre was rooted in the broader struggle for political power during Reconstruction, a time when the newly freed Black population sought to exercise their rights in a hostile and deeply divided South. What unfolded on April 13, 1873, was not just an outbreak of violence, but a calculated attempt to undermine Black political participation and reinforce white supremacy in the post-Civil War South. Following the Civil War, Louisiana, like other Southern states, was undergoing profound political transformation. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 had granted African American men the right to vote, and many black citizens actively participated in the political process. The gubernatorial election of 1872, however, ignited a fierce contest between Republican William P. Kellogg and Democrat John McHenry, both of whom claimed victory. The federal government recognized Kellogg as the legitimate governor, but white Democrats, refusing to concede defeat, launched efforts to overturn Republican control by any means necessary. In Grant Parish, where Colfax was located, black voters and Republican officials attempted to defend their elected government from white supremacist militias. In response to threats and escalating tensions, black citizens took control of the Colfax courthouse, hoping that occupying the building would protect them from violent reprisals. However, on Easter Sunday, April 13, 1873, a large armed white militia, composed of former Confederate soldiers and members of the White League, attacked the courthouse. The massacre that followed was brutal and unrelenting. After an intense firefight, the white militia set fire to the courthouse, forcing many of the black defenders to flee. Those who surrendered were executed on the spot, while others were hunted down and killed. Estimates of the dead vary, but at least 100 black men were slaughtered in what became one of the bloodiest acts of racial terrorism during Reconstruction. Despite the sheer scale of the massacre, justice remained elusive. Federal authorities attempted to prosecute some of the perpetrators under the Enforcement Acts, which were designed to protect black civil rights. However, in the infamous Supreme Court case United States v. Cruikshank, 1876, the justices ruled that the federal government had limited power to intervene in cases of racial violence, effectively gutting Reconstruction-era protections. The ruling emboldened white supremacist groups across the South and paved the way for the dismantling of black political gains through intimidation, voter suppression, and segregation laws. The Colfax Massacre was more than just an isolated incident. It was a turning point in the struggle for racial justice in America. It demonstrated the limits of federal enforcement in protecting black rights, signaled the rise of white supremacist paramilitary organizations, and foreshadowed the end of Reconstruction. The legacy of Colfax lingers in the broader narrative of racial violence and disenfranchisement, a chilling reminder of how deeply contested the fight for civil rights has always been.